I'm Hannah Collins, 23 years old, and I've spent most of my life trying to earn a seat at my own family's table. Thanksgiving was supposed to feel like coming home, but that night, under a chandelier that sparkled like it knew a secret, everything I believed about family cracked open. My grandfather lifted his glass, smiling at me with the warmth of a man who thought he was giving praise, and said, "Glad you're enjoying the college fund we set up for you." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. The room fell quiet, the laughter around us fading like someone had pulled the plug. "What college fund?" I asked, and that single question was the match that lit a lifetime of hidden lies. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to face the truth about the people you trusted most. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the child who followed the rules, who said please and thank you, who never asked for more than she needed. My parents, David and Linda, built their lives around appearances, polished smiles, holiday photos, and a house that always smelled like lemon polish and tension. My father measured love by achievement, and my mother measured it by how we looked to others. My younger brother, Ryan, was their pride, the golden boy with the perfect grades and the easy charm. I learned early that my worth came from staying out of the way. My grandparents were different. Edward and Margaret Collins were the kind of people who sent handwritten letters and called every Sunday just to ask how my week had been. Grandpa Edward built his fortune from nothing. He'd tell stories about sleeping in his car during the early years of his company, and he never let anyone forget that hard work mattered more than pride. He used to slip me $20 bills for emergencies, and Grandma would wink like they were partners in crime. To them, family wasn't just blood. It was a promise to look out for one another. I held on to that promise even when my parents forgot it. By the time I reached college, life had become a careful balancing act. My part-time job at a coffee shop paid just enough to keep the lights on, and scholarships filled the gaps my parents claimed they couldn't afford. Every time I asked for help, Mom would sigh and say, "We're stretched thin, honey. You're so independent you'll manage." So I did. I skipped meals, picked up extra shifts, and pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. Still, I told myself they were doing their best. It's what good daughters are supposed to believe. That Thanksgiving, I arrived at my grandparents' mansion in a thrift store dress I'd pressed twice that morning. The long driveway shimmered under strings of gold lights, each step echoing with the quiet reminder that I didn't belong there. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey wrapped around me. Grandma's voice floated from the kitchen calling my name like it still belonged to someone she'd once rocked to sleep. "There's my girl," she said, her eyes soft and kind. For a moment, the ache in my chest eased. Then the rest of the family arrived. Voices, loud laughter forced. Dad clapped me on the shoulder like I was a colleague he barely knew. Mom kissed the air near my cheek, whispering, "Smile, sweetheart. The photographers are here." Ryan didn't even look up from his phone. The table glittered with crystal and silver, the kind of display meant to impress more than nourish. I sat beside Grandma, trying to make myself small as Aunt Julie began her usual interrogation. "Still single. How's school? Working those little jobs of yours?" Her voice dripped with sugar, but her eyes searched for weakness. I answered politely, every word, measured my smile, practiced. Across the table, Grandpa's deep laughter rolled through the room. He had that kind of presence that filled the air, steady and certain. Watching him, I almost believed in the family image they tried so hard to paint. Maybe I thought this year will be different. Maybe peace can last longer than dinner. The candles flickered, and for a brief second the house felt like the home I used to imagine. Then Grandpa raised his glass. The chandeliers shimmered above us, the silver glinting in his hand. "Glad you're enjoying the college fund we set up for you," he said warmly. The words hit the air like a crack of thunder. My mind tripped over them. College fund. I looked around expecting someone to laugh to explain. No one did. My father coughed into his napkin wine, splashing down his wrist. My mother's face went pale. Even little Caleb stopped chewing. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. "What fund?" I asked, my voice steady but small. The clinking of forks and glasses stopped. My grandfather's smile faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. "The one we started when you were born," he said slowly, as if reminding me of something I should have known. Your parents have been managing it all these years." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. My father stared down at his plate, and my mother's fingers trembled against her wine glass. No one else spoke. I didn't yet understand the full weight of what had been stolen from me, but I could feel it in the way their faces fell, in the sudden chill that crept through that golden room. That was the night when everything began to unravel, the night one careless toast exposed the cracks in a family built on secrets. And as the laughter died around me, I knew nothing about that table, or the people sitting at it, would ever feel like home again. The moment my grandfather's words landed, the room changed. Every sound, the clinking of forks, the hum of conversation faded until there was only the steady thump of my heartbeat in my ears. My father's chair scraped against the polished floor. He coughed hard into his napkin, pretending to swallow wrong, but the red creeping up his neck gave him away. My mother set her fork down, her hand trembling just enough to make the silver ring on her finger quiver. "What fund?" I asked again, this time louder. My grandfather's brow furrowed confusion flickering across his face, as though I'd forgotten something obvious. "The college fund," he said, his tone soft but firm. "The one we started when you were born. Your parents have been managing it since." I turned toward my parents, waiting for them to explain. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes darted between us like she was searching for a script she'd misplaced. Across the table, Uncle Richard's smile twitched, sensing trouble brewing under the candlelight. Aunt Julie leaned in slightly, pretending to adjust her napkin, but hungry for every word. I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on me. "You've been managing it," I said slowly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "Because I've been paying rent with coffee shop tips and living off ramen noodles, and somehow that fund never made it to me." My mother's lips parted. Her voice came out thin, like paper tearing. "Hannah, please. We used it for emergencies for the house, for Ryan's braces, just until we could replace it." My father nodded, his tone sharp with defense. "It was all still family money, and you were doing fine." A short, brittle laugh escaped me. "Fine." The word cracked in the air like dry wood. "Do you even know what fine looked like for me?" My father's jaw twitched, but he didn't answer. My grandfather's expression hardened, all warmth draining from his face. "That money wasn't yours to touch," he said, his voice low and cold. "We made it clear it was for Hannah's education." The silence that followed felt endless. My grandmother's eyes shimmered with tears, her hand resting near her husband's as if to steady him. Uncle Richard cleared his throat, pretending to sip his wine. The cousins stared down at their plates, forks, motionless. For a long moment, no one moved. I looked around that table, crystal glasses, golden light, and faces I thought I knew, and realized the truth had been sitting there all along, hiding behind perfect smiles. I pushed my chair back, the sound echoing through the room. My voice came out calm, almost too calm. "You let me struggle. You watched me work double shifts and skip meals, and you still let me believe there was nothing left to give." My mother reached for me, tears gathering in her eyes. "Sweetheart, please." It wasn't like that. I stepped away before her hand could touch mine. "Don't," I said quietly. "You don't get to fix this with tears." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then my grandfather stood the legs of his chair, groaning against the hardwood. "I trusted you," he said to my father, the disappointment in his voice sharper than anger. "I trusted you with her future." My father started to speak, but my grandfather's tone cut through his words. "Enough." The air seemed to tighten. Even the chandelier light felt colder. I could feel my throat closing, the pressure of emotion building behind my ribs. I turned toward the hallway, my heels clicking against the tile. No one followed. In the mirror near the door, I caught a glimpse of my reflection eyes, red cheeks pale but steady. The woman staring back didn't look like the quiet daughter anymore. Outside, the night air bit against my skin. The mansion behind me glowed in soft gold, its windows like eyes watching me leave. I walked down the long stone path toward my car, every step heavier than the last. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly from inside, forced and hollow. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The roads were empty, the sky black and endless. When I reached my apartment, the quiet felt almost too loud. My dress smelled like flowers and smoke. I slipped it off, leaving it crumpled on the floor, and sat on the edge of my bed. My mind replayed every word. We used it for emergencies. You were doing fine. The sentences circled like vultures. I looked around my small apartment, the flickering light above the sink, the stack of bills on my desk, the peeling paint near the window. Each flaw felt like a monument to the lie I'd been living under. I opened my laptop and searched the name of the bank my grandfather always mentioned when he talked about family accounts. It was a long shot, but it was something. After a few failed attempts and one tense phone call, a representative finally confirmed what I feared most. "Yes, there's an account under your name," she said carefully, "but the balance is 0. I pressed the phone closer. 0. She hesitated. Withdrawals were made regularly over the years, signed by David and Linda Collins. The call ended, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt before. I stared at the dark screen for what felt like hours. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just sat there still as stone, letting the truth settle. It was past midnight when I finally turned off the lamp. The city outside was quiet, just the distant hum of traffic. Lying there, I realized I had no tears left. The betrayal wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, steady, final. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. If they could lie that easily, they had no idea what truth could do when it finally had a voice. The next morning, I didn't call them. I didn't text. I went to work like always, handed out coffee to strangers and smiled when they wished me happy holidays. But underneath the calm, something had changed. The version of me they'd raised, the girl who accepted, forgave, and stayed quiet, was gone. That night, as I locked the door to my apartment, I stood by the window and looked out at the frozen city. The air was still heavy with frost. In that silence, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know what justice would look like yet, but I knew I would find it. And when I did, they would finally understand what it meant to underestimate their daughter. The morning after Thanksgiving felt like waking up in someone else's life. The sunlight that slipped through my window landed on the same small apartment, the same chipped coffee mug on the table, but everything inside me had shifted. The silence that used to comfort me now pressed against my chest, heavy and sharp. I boiled water for instant coffee and watched it swirl, trying not to think about how easily they had lied, how naturally the truth had rolled off my grandfather's tongue like it was supposed to make me proud. I sat at my desk, staring at the half-open envelopes stacked in uneven piles, bills, rent notices, and a few unopened letters from my student loan office. Each one felt heavier than paper should. My phone buzzed once with a text from my mother. "We love you. Let's not make this bigger than it is." I turned the screen face down. The only thing bigger than their lie was the emptiness it left behind. That night, I worked a closing shift at the cafe. The espresso machine hissed like it was tired of listening to stories, and the smell of roasted beans clung to my clothes. My manager, Claire Jensen, a kind woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a patient heart, noticed how quiet I was. "Rough week," she asked gently as she wiped down the counter. I nodded, not trusting my voice to hold steady. She didn't press. "Take an extra muffin home," she said, sliding one toward me with a small smile. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was the only kindness that didn't feel borrowed. When I got home, I opened my laptop again, the glow of the screen lighting up the walls. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before I typed the name of the bank my grandfather had mentioned. The call with the representative still echoed in my mind, how her voice softened when she said the word 0, as if she was trying not to hurt me. Withdrawals signed by David and Linda Collins. It sounded clinical, almost harmless, until I pictured my father's signature curling across a check that wasn't his to write. I printed everything I could find, old pay stubs, financial aid forms, loan statements, and spread them across the floor. The papers overlapped like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. Each document carried a story: the night I skipped dinner to pay for textbooks, the semester I nearly dropped out, when the rent increased, the months I spent convincing myself my parents were doing their best. Looking at those papers, I realized they hadn't just taken money, they'd taken years of peace I could never get back. Sleep didn't come easily. When I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Thanksgiving night, the chandeliers, the polished silver, my mother's pale face, my father's cough. Every time I drifted off, the words came back. We used it for emergencies. I would wake with my heart racing, sitting up in the dark, unsure whether I'd dreamed it or relived it. The next day, I stopped by campus early, still in my coffee-stained uniform. The legal aid office was tucked into a quiet hallway between the library and administration. The woman behind the desk looked up from her papers, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun. Her nameplate read, Patricia Hines. Her voice was calm and steady when she asked how she could help. I handed her the folder I'd built the night before, pages creased, some still damp at the corners. "I need to know if this is something I can report," I said. She flipped through the documents, her expression never changing. "These funds," she asked, "were they intended specifically for you?" I nodded. My grandfather created the account for my education. My parents were supposed to manage it. They spent it all. She paused, tapping one finger against a bank statement. "If that money was designated for your use and they redirected it without consent, that can be considered misappropriation," she said carefully. The word hung in the air like a door creaking open. It may fall under fraud depending on intent and documentation. I stared at the folder, trying to absorb what that meant. Patricia's voice softened. "If you decide to pursue it, you'll need more proof. Keep every receipt, every communication, anything that shows the money was meant for you." When I walked out of her office, the cold air hit me square in the face. The sky had darkened to that pale winter gray that made everything look fragile. I pulled my coat tighter and sat on a bench outside the library, the folder in my lap. For a long moment, I just stared at it. That stack of paper wasn't much, but it was the first thing that felt like control. That evening, I laid everything out again in my apartment. The floor disappeared beneath layers of evidence bank records, old tuition letters, paycheck stubs from every job I'd taken since high school. I spent hours sorting, labeling, highlighting. Each piece of paper told a story I hadn't been brave enough to tell before. When I finally stood, my knees ached and my back stiffened, but the fear that had followed me for years felt quieter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I poured a cup of tea and stood at the glass, watching the city lights flicker below. Somewhere across town, my parents were probably finishing dinner, still pretending the lie could hold. I wondered if they slept well at night, if guilt ever kept them awake. Then I pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter anymore. The next few days passed in slow motion. I went to work, attended classes, and returned home to the folder waiting on my desk. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not my friends, not my grandparents, not even Claire. Every spare hour I had went into organizing the evidence. I started recording dates, emails, bank addresses, and any note that connected the pieces together. The process wasn't fast, but it was steady. By Friday night, the folder had grown thick enough to hold its own weight. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by quiet. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. The same hands that once cleaned coffee spills and counted tips were now holding proof, real, tangible proof, that my life hadn't been as small as they made it seem. When I finally turned off the lights, the papers stayed spread out across the room like a map of where I'd been and where I was going. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled me. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized that silence wasn't strength, it was surrender. And I was done surrendering. I didn't know yet what my next step would look like. All I knew was that the truth was no longer a secret they could bury under polished words and family dinners. I had found my voice, and when the time came, they would hear it. Winter came early that year, painting the streets in quiet gray. The world outside seemed to match the calm I carried inside, not the peace that comes from comfort, but the stillness that follows a storm. My apartment had become a small fortress of paper stacks and notes. Each night after work, I'd sit on the floor with my laptop open, cross-checking dates, withdrawals, and account statements. My coffee table was buried under folders, highlighters, and handwritten lists of everything my parents had touched that wasn't theirs. Patricia from the campus legal office called me twice that week to check in. "Take your time," she said during one of our conversations, her tone measured and patient. "Don't rush just to prove a point. Build it carefully." I appreciated that. Her steadiness was the kind I didn't know I needed. After hanging up, I spent another hour scanning documents, labeling each one by month and transaction. The more I uncovered, the less it surprised me. They hadn't dipped into the fund once or twice, it was systematic. Vacations home, repairs tuition for Ryan. Every year a little more disappeared until nothing remained. There was anger, of course, but it wasn't loud. It was the quiet, focused kind that stays beneath the surface and burns slow. I realized that for most of my life, I'd been taught to stay calm for everyone else's sake, to let things pass to avoid making a scene. But that habit had cost me too much. Every dollar they took had come out of nights I spent studying instead of sleeping, meals skipped and holidays missed because I couldn't afford a bus ticket home. By the third week, I had everything organized into binders, one for financial records, one for correspondence, and another for personal notes that explained what each expense had meant to me. It wasn't just evidence, it was my history written in proof. One night while labeling another folder, I stopped for a moment and looked around. My apartment was small, plain, and quiet, but for the first time it didn't feel like something to be ashamed of. It was mine, paid for by my work, not someone else's choices. The holidays were creeping closer. Store windows glowed with wreaths and gold ribbon, and every commercial on TV seemed to hum with cheer. But beneath all that noise, I felt the opposite of festive. My phone buzzed every few days with texts from my mother, all variations of the same message. "Let's not drag this out. Come home for Christmas." Sometimes she'd add a heart emoji, as if that could undo everything. I didn't respond. One night just before finals week, my grandfather called. His voice was softer than I remembered. "I know what happened at Thanksgiving was hard," he said. "Your grandmother worries about you." "We both do. I told him I was okay, that I was focusing on school." He hesitated before speaking again. "You should come for Christmas, Hannah. I'd like to see you." The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't asking for them, he was asking for me. When the semester ended, I walked out of my last exam feeling lighter. Snow was falling again, covering the sidewalks in a thin white layer. I stopped by a coffee shop near campus and ordered something warm, sitting by the window with my notebook open. It wasn't a plan yet, but the outline of one was forming. Patricia had been right, proof was one thing, but deciding what to do with it was another. Justice didn't happen on its own. That night I called the bank directly. The representative transferred me to the department handling fraud investigations. After a few minutes on hold, a man named Daniel Price picked up. His tone was polite but professional. "We've reviewed your initial claim," he said. "The account's records match your statements. Would you like to proceed with an official report?" I said yes. There was no hesitation. He walked me through the process step by step: written testimony, documentation, identification, verification. It felt strange to discuss my family like a case file, but I reminded myself that this wasn't revenge. It was accountability. When I hung up, the weight in my chest eased a little. The next morning, I went to the post office and mailed the first packet of documents to the bank's fraud department. As I slid the envelope into the slot, my hands didn't shake. I stood there for a moment, watching it disappear, and realized that this was the first act I'd taken for myself in years. The days that followed were quiet. I still worked my shifts, still kept my head down in class, but something had changed. My coworkers noticed it, though they didn't know what it was. "You seem calmer lately," Claire said one evening as she counted the register. "Like you figured something out." I smiled faintly. Something like that. By mid-December, my grandfather called again. "We're having Christmas dinner at the house," he said. "I'd like you to come. Margaret's been baking all week." I hesitated, hearing the warmth in his voice. "Are they going to be there?" I asked. "Yes," he said quietly. "But this time, things will be different." I thought about it for a few days. The invitation sat heavy in my mind while I worked, studied, and walked through the snow-covered streets. Part of me wanted to stay far away, but another part, the one that had spent weeks building folders of proof, knew I needed to face them. Not to forgive, but to finish what had been started. On Christmas Eve, I packed my car with a small overnight bag and the folder I'd built. The roads were slick with snow, the headlights stretching through the darkness like thin threads of light. As the miles rolled by, I felt a quiet steadiness settle in my chest. When I finally turned onto the long driveway to my grandparents' home, the house looked almost the same as it had on Thanksgiving: bright lights, trimmed hedges, the warm glow of windows. But this time, I wasn't arriving as the daughter who had to stay quiet. I was arriving as someone who had finally found her voice. Inside, laughter spilled from the dining room, polished and practiced as ever. I stood in the entryway, coat still in hand, and took a slow breath. My parents were there, of course, perfect posture, perfect smiles, pretending nothing had happened. But my grandfather's eyes met mine from across the room, and he nodded once. It was subtle, but I understood. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about what came next. I hung my coat by the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around me, but the air carried something different this time, anticipation. The kind that comes before the truth finally takes its place at the table. The drive to my grandparents' house felt longer than usual that night. The snow was steady, soft flakes catching in the headlights like dust in sunlight. Every mile closer tightened something in my chest, but I kept going. The folder rested on the passenger seat, thick with every record letter and bank statement I'd collected. The same documents that could prove what they'd done and finally make it real to someone besides me. By the time I reached the long driveway, the house glowed with warm light. I parked near the front steps and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Inside, laughter drifted faintly through the windows. I took a breath, reached for the folder, and walked toward the door. Grandma opened it before I could knock. "Hannah, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice filled with both surprise and relief. "We weren't sure you'd come." I managed a small smile. "Grandpa asked me to." She stepped aside, letting me in. The familiar scent of cinnamon and pine filled the hallway. Everything looked the same garland across the staircase, crystal ornaments hanging from the chandelier. But it all felt colder somehow. When I stepped into the living room, the conversation stopped for just a heartbeat before starting again, a little louder this time. My father stood by the fireplace, glass in hand, posture rigid. My mother sat near the tree, twisting her bracelet around her wrist. "Hannah," she said with a bright, brittle tone, "you made it." My father nodded stiffly. "Good to see you." It sounded like a lie. Ryan waved from the couch without looking up from his phone. Aunt Julie's eyes flicked over me, taking in my simple black dress and the folder in my hand. "Still working hard, I see," she said with a half smile. I didn't respond. Grandpa was at the dining table setting down a pitcher of water. When he saw me, he gave a small nod that said more than words could. Dinner started the way it always did, with surface-level talk about weather work and Christmas plans. The candles flickered, and the silverware glinted beneath the chandelier. My parents laughed in all the right places, filling any silence that might let the truth creep in. Aunt Julie mentioned some neighbor's vacation to Hawaii. Uncle Richard complained about property taxes. Everything sounded ordinary practiced. Then just before dessert, my father tapped his spoon against his glass. I just want to say he began smiling at the room like a man giving a speech he'd rehearsed, that family means everything. We've all had our disagreements, but what matters is that we stick together, especially during the holidays. My mother nodded beside him, eyes glistening like she might cry on cue. I waited until he sat back down before I reached for the folder beside my chair. My hands didn't shake. "Since Thanksgiving," I said quietly, "I've been trying to understand one thing." The sound of my voice cut through the chatter. Everyone looked up. "What fund?" The room fell silent. My grandfather's expression sharpened. My mother's hand froze halfway to her glass. "I have the answer now." I continued sliding the folder onto the table. "Every withdrawal, every date, every signature. You didn't use the college fund for me. You used it for yourselves, for the house, the car, Ryan's tuition, even vacations." My mother's face drained of color. "Hannah, please," she whispered, "not tonight." My father's jaw tightened. "You have no right." I cut him off. "No right. That money was meant for my education. I worked night shifts and skipped meals while you spent what was meant to secure my future." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire. Aunt Julie leaned forward slightly, pretending to straighten her napkin, but watching every word unfold like a spectator at a play. Ryan lowered his phone, confusion spreading across his face. "Wait," he said quietly. "There was a fund." I turned to him. "Yes, one that was supposed to be mine." His eyes darted toward our parents, but neither of them looked at him. Grandpa reached for the folder, his movements slow but deliberate. He flipped through the pages, the sound of paper echoing louder than any voice. His hands trembled slightly as he read, his expression darkening with every line. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You stole from your own daughter." My mother's tears spilled over, but her words came fast, almost panicked. "We didn't mean to, Dad. We were going to replace it. Things just got tight." My father tried to steady his voice. "We did what we had to do for the family." Grandpa's eyes hardened. "No," he said, his tone low and final. "You did what was easiest for you. That fund was her future. You took it because you thought she wouldn't fight back." The silence that followed was heavier than before. My grandmother pressed a hand to her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. Uncle Richard cleared his throat like he wanted to speak, then thought better of it. The ticking of the old grandfather clock filled the pauses between our breaths. I met my father's eyes. "I've already filed a report," I said softly. "The bank has everything. There'll be an investigation and repayment requirements. This isn't just a family matter anymore." My mother gasped. "You're taking legal action against us?" I nodded. "No, I'm holding thieves accountable." The word landed like a stone. My father slammed his palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "You're suing your own parents," he said, his voice rising. "You're destroying this family." I stayed calm. "You destroyed it when you decided my future was optional." My grandfather stood, then the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. He walked around the table and stopped beside me. I expected him to be angry that I'd made a scene, but instead he placed his hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You don't have to face this alone." Across the table, my father's face twisted with disbelief. "You're taking her side," he said. Grandpa's voice was steady. "There's only one side here, the truth." No one spoke after that. The room was frozen in that moment, the air heavy with everything that couldn't be unsaid. I gathered the folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. My mother called after me, her voice cracking. "Please, Hannah, we can fix this." I paused in the doorway, turning just enough to meet her eyes. "You can't fix something you never intended to keep whole." Outside, the snow had thickened. It swirled through the air, soft and relentless. My footsteps crunched across the driveway as I walked toward my car. Behind me, the windows of the house glowed with gold light, but the warmth inside no longer belonged to me. I brushed snow off the windshield and glanced back once more. They were still inside, facing what they'd done. For the first time, I didn't feel small. The cold stung my cheeks as I started the engine, but it didn't bother me. I drove away with steady hands and a quiet I hadn't known in years. The road ahead was blanketed in white, the world hushed except for the hum of the tires on snow. And as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something honest. When I woke the next morning, snow still covered everything, like the night had pressed pause on the world. The house I'd left behind sat somewhere miles away, heavy with silence, and the kind of truth that doesn't wash off. I made coffee and watched the steam rise from the cup, realizing how calm I felt. Not happy, not angry, just still. By afternoon, I got an email from the bank's fraud department. The subject line read, "Update on your case." I opened it slowly, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. The investigation had officially begun. Every withdrawal, every forged signature, every misuse of the account was under review. They'd confirmed that the money was legally mine and that my parents' actions fell under financial misconduct. There were words like liability and repayment requirements. But what stood out most was one sentence: if fraud is established, parties responsible will be held accountable. I closed the laptop and leaned back. The words didn't bring joy or revenge, just something quieter, relief. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. That evening I called Patricia to tell her about the update. She listened, letting me read the key parts aloud. When I finished, she said, "It sounds like they're moving quickly." "That's good. Remember, this isn't about punishing them, it's about protecting your rights." I thanked her, and she reminded me to keep every communication logged. Her voice was even professional, but there was kindness underneath. The days that followed passed slowly. The holidays had emptied the city, leaving streets half-lit and quiet. My shifts at the coffee shop were shorter, and the regular customers were mostly gone, replaced by travelers passing through. I didn't mind the stillness. It gave me time to think, to let things settle into their new shape. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the counter, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a familiar voice spoke on the other end. "Hannah, it's Grandpa." His tone was softer than before, carrying a mix of pride and sorrow. "I wanted to let you know the family's been talking. It's not pleasant, but they're finally seeing things clearly." I stayed quiet, unsure what to say. "You did what none of us were brave enough to," he added, "and I want you to know you're not alone in this." For a second, my throat tightened. "Thank you," I said, my voice low. He continued, "Also, there's something waiting for you at the bank. A little help from me, not to fix what they broke, but to help you start new." The next day, I went to the branch downtown, the same one where the investigation had started. The lobby smelled faintly of pine, and a row of poinsettias lined the front desk. When the teller recognized my name, she smiled politely and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, she returned with a white envelope sealed with the bank stamp. Inside was a cashier's check and a folded note written in my grandfather's familiar, neat handwriting. "For your start, not your survival." Below it, a number I hadn't expected, $20,000. Enough to breathe again, enough to move forward. My hands trembled as I traced the letters of his name. That evening I sat at my kitchen table staring at the check in the soft yellow glow of the lamp. I thought about how differently love and loyalty could look under the same family name. My parents had taken from me out of comfort. My grandfather had given back out of conviction. It wasn't about money. It was about restoring something deeper. The next morning, I went online and made a payment toward my student loans. Watching the balance shrink felt like watching a weight lift off my chest inch by inch. I opened a new account in my name, only no joint access, no shared signatures. For the first time, my finances, my future, everything belonged solely to me. Winter lingered longer than usual, but I didn't mind the cold. I spent my mornings finishing final papers for the semester, and my evenings walking through the snow-lined park near my apartment. The air was sharp and clean, the world quiet except for the sound of my boots on frozen ground. A week later, an envelope arrived from the bank, thick and stamped confidential. I sat down before opening it. Inside was the formal confirmation I'd been waiting for. The investigation had found substantial evidence of fraud. My parents were liable for the full amount withdrawn plus penalties. There was no note, no apology, no warning, just facts. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Justice doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it comes on white paper with black ink. That night I called my grandfather to tell him. He didn't sound surprised. "Good," he said simply. "Maybe now they'll understand the value of honesty." His voice wavered slightly before softening. "You did what was right, Hannah. I know it wasn't easy. We talked for a while about school, my job, Grandma's health, even the weather. He never mentioned my parents again, and I didn't bring them up. Some things didn't need to be said." When the call ended, I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest. Over the next few days, I focused on finishing schoolwork and finalizing my next steps. The spring semester would be my last before graduation, and for the first time, the future didn't look like a distant struggle. It looked possible. One evening, I found myself driving past my parents' neighborhood. The streets were lined with lights, the lawns still covered in snow. Their house looked the same, windows glowing wreath on the door. But I didn't stop. There was nothing left for me inside those walls. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. When I returned home, I sat by the window with a blanket and watched the snow drift past the streetlight. The world outside was quiet, but inside something new had begun to settle, something steady and sure. The fear that had followed me for years was gone, replaced by something that felt like peace. I wasn't the same girl who once begged for approval or apologized for asking questions. That version of me had been built to keep others comfortable. The woman sitting here now had learned that silence doesn't protect it, only delays the truth. The letter from the bank lay on the table beside me, folded and sealed. I'd keep it not as a reminder of pain, but of the moment I stopped being powerless. Outside, the snow began to fall again, thick and slow, covering the street in a clean white sheet. And as I watched it from my window, I knew that for the first time in a long time, everything ahead was finally mine to shape. A week after the letter arrived, confirming the investigation's outcome, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. The number wasn't familiar, but something told me to answer. "Ms. Collins," a man's voice asked. "This is Daniel Price from First County Bank. I wanted to let you know the case has been closed." My heart slowed as he continued. "Liability has been assigned to your parents. The repayment schedule has been set, and they've been notified of the bank's final decision." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle. "It's officially over." I thanked him quietly. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone still in my hand, the morning light spilling across the room. I didn't smile or cry. I just exhaled a long, steady breath that felt like one I'd been holding for years. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. I still went to work at the cafe, still turned in assignments, but something inside me had shifted. The heaviness that used to sit at the back of my mind was gone. For once, my life wasn't defined by what they'd taken from me. It was mine again. One evening after my shift, I stopped at the mailbox before heading upstairs. A thick envelope sat inside, stamped with my grandfather's return address. Inside was a short, handwritten note and a folded document. The note read, "I thought you should have a copy for your records. Love, Grandpa." The document was a copy of the repayment confirmation from the bank official, proof that justice had been served. At the bottom, my parents' signatures appeared side by side, small and tight, like they'd been written through gritted teeth. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and sat by the window, the city lights reflecting against the glass. I thought about all the years I'd believed silence kept peace, how I'd learned to bite my tongue just to keep things steady. Now that quiet had turned into strength. It was strange how justice didn't feel like victory. It just felt like balance restored. A few days later, Grandpa called. His voice carried that familiar, steady calm. "I heard from the bank," he said. "You held your ground, Hannah. I'm proud of you." I thanked him, unsure how to respond. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Your parents, they're not taking it well. I don't expect you to feel sorry for them, but I know you might hear things." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. "Whatever they say, remember, you didn't destroy anything. You simply told the truth." I could hear Grandma in the background, her soft voice reminding him to tell me they loved me. He did before hanging up. Later that week, a letter arrived from my parents. The envelope was thin, the handwriting unmistakably my mother's. I placed it on the table and stared at it for hours before opening it. Inside was a short note written in her careful script. "We never meant to hurt you. We thought we were helping the family. Please don't shut us out forever. Love, Mom." There was no apology for what they'd done, no acknowledgement of how deeply it had cut. I folded the letter back into its envelope and set it aside. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't reply either. Some things didn't need answers. That weekend I drove to visit my grandparents. Their house looked different under the pale winter sun, less imposing, more peaceful. Grandma greeted me at the door with open arms, pulling me into a long hug. "It's good to have you here," she said, her eyes misty. Grandpa was in his study, a stack of papers beside him. When he saw me, he smiled. "Come in, Hannah. I've got something for you." He handed me a small envelope sealed and labeled with my name. Inside was a check and another note written in his tidy handwriting, "For your start, not your survival." The same words as before. "It's yours," he said simply. "Use it for something that builds your life, not repairs it." My eyes stung, but I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't owe me anything." He smiled faintly. "It's not about owing. It's about making sure the good isn't forgotten." We had dinner together that evening, just the three of us. The air was warm, filled with the sound of Grandma's laughter and the clink of silverware. No one mentioned my parents. It felt like a small pocket of peace carved out of the chaos. Afterward, as I was leaving, Grandpa walked me to the car. The snow crunched under our shoes. "You know," he said, "sometimes doing the right thing feels lonelier than doing nothing at all. "But that doesn't make it wrong." He gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You did right." Driving home, his words stayed with me. The city lights blurred against the windshield, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free. The anger, the exhaustion, the endless explanations, I'd left them behind at that table months ago. The following week, I used part of Grandpa's gift to pay down more of my student loans, and the rest to enroll in a certification course I'd been putting off for years. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet step toward a life I could finally call my own. Spring crept in slowly. The air softened. The snow melted into streams that ran down the sidewalks, and the world seemed to stretch awake again. One afternoon, I stopped by the campus library to print out the confirmation for my course enrollment. As I waited for the printer, I caught my reflection in the glass door, same brown hair, same eyes, but different somehow, lighter. That evening I met Patricia for coffee. She'd followed my case closely from the start, and when she saw me, her face broke into a proud smile. So she said, stirring her drink, "How does it feel to have it all settled?" I thought for a moment before answering. "It feels quiet," I said, "but the kind of quiet that means peace." She nodded. "That's the best kind." When I left the cafe, the sky was streaked with gold, the air cool but gentle. I walked slowly to my car, the weight I'd carried for so long finally gone. The truth had done what it was meant to do. It set things right. As I drove home, the sun dipped below the horizon, and a thin crescent moon rose above the city. The world outside was still, but inside I felt the steady rhythm of something new beginning. Justice didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with breathing again deeply and freely. And as I pulled into my driveway, I knew the next chapter of my life would start not with what had been taken, but with everything I was finally free to build. Spring came early that year, soft and bright, as if the world had been waiting to exhale. My apartment windows stayed open most days, letting in the scent of rain and the sound of birds echoing down the street. Graduation was only weeks away, and with it came a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The weight that had followed me through sleepless nights and long work shifts was gone, replaced by something calm, something earned. On the morning of the ceremony, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the tassel on my cap. The reflection staring back at me felt familiar but stronger. My face carried the same features, but my eyes had changed. They no longer searched for approval, they held it. The ceremony was held outside under a pale blue sky. Rows of chairs stretched across the field, each filled with families' cameras and bursts of laughter. When my name was called, I walked across that stage with my heart steady, my steps sure. The applause wasn't loud, but it was enough. In the crowd, I saw two faces that mattered most, Grandpa and Grandma sitting side by side, clapping with quiet pride. Afterward, we met by the oak trees near the gate. Grandpa handed me a small bouquet of white lilies. "For your next beginning," he said. Grandma kissed my cheek, her eyes glistening. "You did it, sweetheart." I smiled, and for a moment the noise of the crowd faded. There was only gratitude, simple and whole. My parents weren't there. Neither was Ryan. I had known they wouldn't come. The distance between us wasn't measured in miles anymore, but in choices. Still, I didn't feel bitterness. I'd carried enough of that. Forgiveness wasn't about letting them back in. It was about freeing myself from the weight of what they'd done. That evening, after the celebration dinner with my grandparents, I walked alone through the quiet streets back to my apartment. The air smelled of fresh rain, and the city lights shimmered against puddles on the sidewalk. I thought about everything that had led me here, the nights of silence, the letters, the confrontation at Christmas, the investigation that had changed everything. Each moment had been a brick in the foundation of who I was becoming. When I reached home, I set my diploma on the table beside the folder that had once held every painful piece of evidence. I opened it one last time, not to relive the anger, but to see how far I'd come. The documents no longer felt like proof of betrayal. They felt like chapters of a story that had finally reached its truth. A week later, I received another envelope from the bank. Inside was a final notice confirming the account closure and repayment in full. No more pending investigations, no unresolved debts, just an ending. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into a drawer, and decided that would be the last time I'd open anything tied to my parents' names. I spent the next few days planning, quietly applying for jobs, setting goals, making lists of places I wanted to see. I didn't want revenge or apology anymore. I wanted peace, and I was building it one small choice at a time. One Sunday morning, I stopped by my grandparents' house. Grandma was in the garden tending to her tulips, while Grandpa read the paper on the porch. "You look content," he said when I sat beside him. "I am," I told him. He nodded a knowing smile, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Life doesn't owe us fairness, but it does offer second chances to those who seek truth." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You taught me that," I said. Later, as I drove home, the radio played softly, an old song from my childhood. I turned the volume up just enough to hear the melody drift through the open window. The city stretched ahead golden in the afternoon light. I realized that somewhere along the way, justice had stopped being about punishment. It had become about reclaiming peace, protecting what mattered, and refusing to be defined by pain. That night I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sky fade from amber to dusk. The air carried the promise of summer, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready for whatever came next. My story didn't end with anger or loss. It ended with quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be known. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the ones who stand beside you when truth costs everything. And strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's found in the steady breath that follows survival. If you've ever had to walk away to protect your peace, know that it isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And if you're listening tonight, I hope this story reminds you that truth once spoken always finds its way home. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more journeys of courage and quiet redemption, stay a while and subscribe. Because healing doesn't always come from winning, it comes from finally letting go.